In an effort to give you all the window tint knowledge you might need, either to get tint on your own vehicle or to walk your clients through getting window tint on their car, we wanted to take a deeper dive in. I have with me our president, John Clevin, who's going to help us do so and make sure that you are making the most informed choice possible when it comes to purchasing window tint. But before we do get started, if you haven't checked out our What is Tint videos, make sure to check those as a good overview. And now we're going to get into each of the individual components that make up our window films. But John, when we're shopping for window tint, there's a lot that's going on here. We have a lot on the table. Where do we even start the conversation?
Well, as an installer and as a consumer, you want to know that the very best products are being used in your film that's being made, because there's a lot of different variables, there's a lot of different ingredients that can be added that can sometimes appear that a film is a very high performance film, and sometimes they're designed around beating a meter is what we call it. So some of these ingredients can be used in window films that will appear to provide amazing performance benefits, but they're not really covering the full spectrum of performance for your window films.
Sure. So, as a baseline, maybe what's the most common raw material that we see in the window films, and what's maybe some differences in the way that STEK is sourcing it compared to some of the competitors?
Sure. So I want to start from the base. All window tint is made with a PET material. So PET is a plastic, and a lot of times to get it cheaper, a lot of companies will use a recycled product, okay? Window film only has so much shrinkage available to that plastic. So when a film is recycled, it's heated, and this can not only cause haze and distortions in the film, but also it will pre-shrink the material. So that means when we go to shrink it to fit on your vehicle, we can sometimes be out of shrink. So meaning we don't have enough
manipulation.
Exactly, yeah, in that product to be able to conform it easily onto a vehicle with a very curved glass.
Interesting. And so when it comes to STEK sourcing PET, you mentioned that some are using recycled. What kind of PET are we using?
Okay, so we're only using A-grade premium non-recycled PET. And this is going to be a great benefit not only to the installer, because they're going to be able to more easily install our film, but it's also a benefit to the consumer because it's going to be a more durable, clear, optically orange peel free film versus a recycled film.
Gotcha. So overall, higher quality look, better optical clarity, and it sounds like material handling will be easier for the installer as well.
That's correct, yep.
Awesome. Awesome. And so obviously these films need to stick to the glass, and I think maybe that's a good place to lead the conversation is the adhesives. We know that these are applied to the surface and they have to stick to that surface. In some initial research I was doing, I see that generally the failure point is from the adhesive, or a lot of the issues you might see long term. So maybe you can speak towards what STEK's doing to make sure our adhesive is high quality as possible, and how is that different than some of the competitors?
Absolutely. So we use a pressure sensitive adhesive that's a rigid structure, and by having a rigid structure you're going to have a much smoother finish with less orange peel. This is also going to provide great adhesion for long term. So we have a lifetime warranty in our film. You're not going to see it starting to bubble up and like things that you see on cheap quality materials, and sometimes you see that on cars that have only been tinted for a year or two. So
yeah, absolutely. And just the nature of window tint, you're going to have a lot of that UV exposure, and we know that UV is extremely damaging. And so
yep.
having this, rigid, pressure-sensitive adhesive allows that film to stay adhered to the surface and to combat all those UV rays for years and years down the road. Where again, what you were just talking about is that bubbling, which is just a sign of cheap adhesive.
That's really right. Yep.
Between the different window films, you obviously have varying levels of performance. And so now we want to dive in to break down what components go into your dyed or your carbon films and your ceramic films that give you the performance you're looking for. So now that we know some of the most important base materials that go into our window films, we're going to introduce each of the STEK Tint series and the different raw materials that we see in each. As we jump into then our action series, this is our carbon window film. Yep. And I believe it's called carbon because we're using an actual carbon particle in it. What are some of the properties of carbon, and maybe how is STEK introducing these particles different than the competitors?
Sure. So our carbon is broken down about 10 times more than a standard nanocarbon. And what this does is give our film a much greater clarity. Carbon does, however, have its limitations. So it can only provide IR heat blocking, usually of about 30%. But that number changes because the more carbon you add, the darker the film will be. So it's always a balance in these films of how much raw material to add if you want to keep the film light and performing well. So that's why some of our higher end films are going to be better in the lighter films.
Sure, just based on the raw materials that they're using on those higher end films.
Correct, yeah.
Well, a fun fact for you guys on carbon as well, this is actually the same material that you might have in your pencil lead. So you are very familiar with it, you've probably even seen it before, but it can be really useful for window tint films as well. So as we jump into the next series, our Smart series, ironically, what raw materials do we see introduced that's not in the carbon? And again, is STEK doing anything different with those in particular?
Yep, so we are using tungsten, and tungsten is going to give our films a really great heat rejection in the near IR. So we're going to talk about that later, but there's a wide spectrum of wavelengths of light that you can see or not see that could be creating heat. So tungsten, however, does have a little bit of a bluish color, and because of this, we do also add carbon to the film. So at STEK, we don't want to add dyes to our high performance films. And so we have to have a delicate balance to get the VLT that we want and also to get the performance that we want.
Yeah. And then for our viewers, VLT is visible light transmittance, essentially how much light is it letting in or how much light is it blocking. So with that combination, we do see a nice light blue hue with the Smart series, but it is very appealing, and you get a little bit more heat rejection than you might in the Action.
That's correct.
Awesome. Last and not least, we are talking about our NEX series. Now this is our graphene infused window film, and it also has additional couple ceramic components. Maybe you can help speak towards those.
Yep, absolutely. So we're really, really proud of our NEX series. We do have a patent pending on graphene in the film. So this is a combination of carbon, ATO, ITO, and graphene. And so this is going to cover basically all the wavelengths from a near IR, a mid-range IR, and a far IR to give you that protection all the way through the range. So whatever meter you put on NEX, you put it on a measurement at a near or a far IR, it's going to perform really, really well. Also, this film, because it has the graphene, it's a super fast thermal conductor. So that means it dissipates heat incredibly quick. So copper used to be kind of the gold standard, I guess, or the copper standard. And graphene will dissipate heat about 18 times faster than copper.
Wow.
So by allowing the window to stay cooler, the film can perform its best for a longer period of time. So any film, if it gets overheated for hours and hours and hours, it's not going to perform like it did when it was, at a room temperature, 60, 70 degrees. But once it's, 120 degree film, the performance characteristics of any film will go down. So by having graphene in there, we can keep that performance much, much, much longer.
Awesome. And if I dissected that correctly, essentially the graphene is acting like a battery. It's allowing the other ceramic particles, the ATO, ITO, and I believe there's some tungsten in NEX too, just to perform more efficiently. And so graphene in itself is not rejecting the heat, but it is just allowing that thermal energy to get dispersed a lot more. Well guys, we appreciate you tuning back in, and we hope that you learned a little bit more about your window tints, what goes into them, and maybe some of the factors you should think about when you're buying your own. If you have any questions, let us know in the comments below, and as always, stay tuned on our social.